The aroma of roast chicken and rosemary wafted through the air as Charlotte set the table for dinner. The familiar clatter of plates and cutlery was a comforting sound in the otherwise quiet house. Her husband, Francis, was in the kitchen, humming softly as he poured 2 glasses of wine. The evening was peaceful, and everything appeared perfect on the surface, but underneath, Charlotte felt the simmering tension that had been building for months. As they sat down to eat, Charlotte glanced at Francis, trying to read the emotions behind his calm exterior. His sandy hair was beginning to gray at the temples, a testament to the years they had spent together. They talked about mundane things, the weather, a neighbor's new dog, and an upcoming charity event. Their conversation was polite, but lacked the intimacy they once shared. Charlotte nodded and smiled at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere. Her thoughts drifted to Derek, the man she planned to see later that night. Her pulse quickened at the thought of him, a mixture of excitement and guilt twisting inside her. They had met 6 months ago at a work conference in California. Charlotte remembered how their eyes met across a crowded room, the instant spark of connection that felt electric. They had ended up talking for hours, discovering shared interests and dreams. Charlotte was drawn to Derek's easy confidence and the way he made her feel alive. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen and understood in a way she hadn't felt in years. Their affair had begun almost without her realizing it, each meeting more intoxicating than the last. Despite her feelings for Derek, Charlotte was haunted by the betrayal of Francis, who she knew loved her deeply. The guilt weighed heavily on her, yet the thrill of her secret life was addictive. It was as though she was living 2 separate lives, each pulling her in different directions. With Francis, she was the dedicated wife, the partner who shared in their life's daily routines. With Derek, she was someone else entirely, a woman who laughed more freely, who dreamed of adventure and possibilities. As dinner ended, Francis mentioned a weekend trip they had planned months ago. "We could leave early on Friday," he suggested, his voice hopeful. Charlotte hesitated, her mind racing. "I'll have to check my schedule," she replied, forcing a smile. "Work has been crazy lately." In truth, she had planned to spend a wild weekend with Derek, a getaway they had been looking forward to for weeks. Francis nodded, and Charlotte wondered if he noticed the distance between them, the subtle shift that had grown over time. After dinner, Charlotte excused herself, claiming she was meeting a friend for coffee. Francis kissed her cheek, his touch gentle and warm. "Have fun," he said, his smile genuine. Charlotte's heart ached as she left the house, a part of her longing to turn back and confess everything. But the other part, the part that longed for Derek, drove her forward. She felt trapped between 2 worlds, each demanding something she couldn't fully give. The drive to Derek's apartment was short, and as she parked her car, she felt a familiar rush of excitement. Derek greeted her with a wide grin, pulling her into his arms. "I've missed you," he murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. Charlotte melted into his embrace, the worries of the day slipping away. They spent the evening talking and laughing, doing wild things in his bed and sharing dreams of a future together that seemed almost tangible. Derek talked about a job offer he had in San Francisco, and Charlotte imagined what it would be like to start anew in a city far away from her current life. "Do you ever think about what it would be like?" Derek asked, his voice soft and filled with longing. "Just us, starting fresh?" Charlotte hesitated, the fantasy tempting but fraught with uncertainty. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But it's complicated, Derek. I can't just walk away." Derek nodded, his expression understanding but tinged with frustration. "I know, but I wish it were different." As the night wore on, they held each other close, savoring the moments of happiness they could steal. But as Charlotte headed home in the early morning, her heart was heavy with the weight of reality. She wondered how long she could maintain this double life, balancing the thrill of her affair with the guilt of betrayal. Driving through the quiet streets, Charlotte contemplated the choices she had made. She knew a storm was brewing on the horizon, but she didn't yet know how devastating it would be. For now, she pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the road ahead and the challenges she would face when morning came. Charlotte stepped through the door of her home, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion mixed with the residual thrill of the night. She kicked off her shoes and sighed, hoping for a moment of peace before confronting another day. The house was quiet, the morning sun filtering softly through the curtains, casting gentle patterns on the floor. Charlotte's mind was still swirling with images of Derek, their conversations, and the warmth of his touch. She sank onto the couch, closing her eyes briefly, savoring the fleeting sense of escape. But just as she began to unwind, her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. The sound, usually innocuous, now carried a sense of urgency that made her stomach tighten. She fished the phone out and glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Derek's name flashing. Charlotte. His voice was frantic, words tumbling out in a rush. Your husband came to my place with a magnum. I'm trapped in the bathroom. I only have a few more minutes. Help, call the cops now. The world tilted, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she was paralyzed, her mind struggling to process Derek's words. Francis knew. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed facade had shattered, and she was plunged into a nightmare she couldn't have imagined. How did this happen? She thought, her mind racing. How did he find out? Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to dial the police. She could barely think, every nerve in her body screaming for action. But the panic made her clumsy, and she kept hitting the wrong numbers. Come on, she muttered under her breath, frustration mixing with fear. Finally, she managed to dial 911, her voice shaking as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Please, you have to hurry. My husband has a gun, and he's at my friend's house. He's trapped in the bathroom. Please, you have to help him. As she spoke, a chilling thought crept into her mind. What if she was too late? What if Francis had already acted on his rage and desperation? The fear clawed at her, making it hard to breathe. The dispatcher's calm voice brought her back to the moment. Ma'am, we have officers on the way. Please stay on the line and give us your location. Charlotte rattled off the address, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. How could everything have unraveled so quickly? Just hours ago, she had been with Derek, laughing and dreaming of a future together. Now, that dream was on the brink of turning into a nightmare. Determined to prevent a tragedy, Charlotte grabbed her keys and raced out the door, her heart pounding with a desperate urgency. She barely registered her surroundings as she jumped into her car, her mind focused only on reaching Derek before it was too late. The city blurred around her as she sped through the streets, the engine roaring in protest as she pushed it to its limits. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white with tension. Every red light felt like an eternity, every car in her path an obstacle to be overcome. Images flashed through her mind. Francis's face when he found out, twisted with anger and betrayal. Derek's voice, filled with fear and desperation. Her own actions, leading her to this moment. The enormity of the situation pressed down on her, but she forced herself to keep going, to stay focused. How could I let this happen? She thought, guilt and regret gnawing at her insides. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. As she drove, Charlotte tried to make sense of how Francis had discovered the affair. She thought back to recent weeks, replaying their conversations in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed. Had he seen a message on her phone? Had someone told him? The questions were endless, and the answers eluded her. But now was not the time for reflection. Now was the time for action. She pushed the car harder, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon, her mind a blur of fear and desperation. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a soft vibration that seemed to mock her helplessness. It was Derek again, his number flashing on the screen, but this time it was silent. The line was dead when she answered, the silence on the other end a hollow reminder of how little time he might have left. She tried calling him back repeatedly, her voice breaking as each attempt went unanswered, fueling her anxiety to new heights. Her mind spun back to the conversations she'd shared with Derek in their stolen moments together. The easy laughter, the shared dreams of a future free of complications, now felt painfully fleeting and fragile. She recalled the way he would smile at her, a smile that promised a world where they could be happy and unburdened. But now, All those moments seemed like wisps of smoke, slipping through her fingers as reality crashed in. As Charlotte drove, her thoughts turned to Francis, and she flashed back to moments that seemed innocent at the time. She remembered a strange look he had given her just last week, a moment of silence that felt loaded with unspoken questions. Had he suspected something then? She recalled the offhand comment he made about her late nights, his voice casual but his eyes studying her intently. "What's keeping you out so late these days, honey?" Francis had asked, his tone light but probing. "Oh, just work. You know how it is," Charlotte had replied, waving it off with a forced smile. "We've got a big project deadline." The memory of that exchange now felt like a warning she'd ignored, a sign she had missed in her rush to live a double life. She'd been caught up in her fantasy with Derek, dismissing the signs as paranoia. Now, she wondered if Francis had been piecing it together all along, silently watching and waiting. The buildings flew past her in a blur, the city unfolding like a film reel she couldn't stop. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but there was no time for answers, only action. She needed to reach Derek, to prevent the unthinkable from happening. Her foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car responding with a surge of power that propelled her forward. Finally, she reached Derek Street, the familiar sight of his building coming into view. Her heart pounded with renewed urgency as she screeched to a halt outside, barely taking the time to turn off the engine before she was out of the car and running. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted across the pavement, her mind a chaotic swirl of fear and determination. Charlotte burst through the building's front door, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. She dashed toward the elevator, jabbing the button repeatedly, willing the doors to open faster. Every second stretched interminably as she waited, the tension coiling tighter in her chest. When the elevator finally arrived, she stepped inside, pressing the button for Derek's floor with a shaky finger. The ascent felt agonizingly slow, each floor passing with excruciating deliberation. She leaned against the wall, her heart pounding like a drum, her mind filled with silent prayers that she wasn't too late. "Cops haven't arrived yet." Charlotte's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she burst through Derek's apartment door, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The sight that greeted her was a harrowing contrast to the warmth and intimacy she had experienced only hours before. The living room was a chaotic mess, furniture overturned, and scattered papers and personal items strewn across the floor. The once cozy space now bore the brutal marks of a violent struggle. Her eyes were immediately drawn to a disturbing detail, a trail of dark, red stains leading from the living room toward the bathroom. The blood seemed to mark a path of devastation, each drop a stark reminder of the horror that had unfolded. Charlotte's legs felt like lead as she followed the trail, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of what she was seeing with the frantic call she had received. She reached the bathroom door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The door creaked ominously, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The scene that met her eyes was one of utter devastation. Derek lay sprawled on the floor, his body motionless. The sight of him, once so full of life and laughter, now lifeless and still, hit Charlotte like a tidal wave. Her vision blurred with tears, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "No, no, no, no," she cried, collapsing beside him. Her sobs were raw and guttural, the weight of her grief and guilt crashing down on her like a relentless wave. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched Derek's cold, lifeless hand, the finality of his death overwhelming her. Her cries of despair seemed to fill the room, a mournful lament for the life that had been so abruptly snatched away. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Charlotte sat there, her mind numb and her heart heavy with sorrow. She could barely hear the sounds of sirens approaching, the reality of the situation too consuming for her to fully process. The images of their stolen moments together replayed in her mind, mingling with the harsh truth of his death. She thought of Derek's laughter, his dreams, the future they had envisioned together, now all gone in a senseless act of violence. The police arrived, their footsteps echoing in the hallway as they approached the apartment. Charlotte barely registered their presence as they entered, her body curled in a protective huddle beside Derek. The officers, led by a detective with a stern but compassionate demeanor, began to survey the scene, their eyes taking in the signs of the struggle and the blood trail. "Ma'am, can you step away from the body, please?" The detective's voice cut through Charlotte's fog of grief, but it felt distant and unreal. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, and nodded numbly. The detective and his team began to work, their movements methodical and efficient as they began their investigation. Charlotte's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and regret, her thoughts spinning back to the call she had received and the desperate drive that had led her here. As the officers began to take statements and gather evidence, Charlotte was led to a quieter part of the apartment, away from the grim scene. She sat down heavily, her body trembling with the aftershocks of her sobs. The detective approached her, his expression a mixture of professionalism and empathy. "I need you to tell me what happened," he said gently, taking out a notepad. "Start from the beginning. Anything you can remember." Charlotte took a shuddering breath, trying to calm herself enough to speak. I got a call from Derek," she began, her voice shaky. "He said my husband had come to his place with a gun. He was trapped in the bathroom. He was so scared. I tried to call the police, but I couldn't get through. I rushed over as fast as I could." She paused, her voice catching in her throat as she fought to keep control. "When I got here, the door was open. I followed the trail of blood to the bathroom, and I found him like this." The detective listened intently, jotting down notes as Charlotte spoke. His expression remained calm, but his eyes conveyed a deep understanding of the gravity of the situation. As Charlotte recounted the frantic call, her drive to the apartment, and her arrival at the scene, she felt a crushing weight of regret settle over her. "I should have been here sooner," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe I could have stopped this. If only I'd seen the signs, if only I'd been more careful." The detective placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's important to stay calm and answer any questions we have. We'll need to understand everything that led up to this to piece together what happened." Charlotte nodded, her head spinning with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. As the officers continued their investigation, she sat in the corner of the room, her gaze fixed on the floor. The realization of the full extent of her actions, the betrayal, the secrecy, the fatal confrontation, crashed over her like an unrelenting tide. In that moment, Charlotte was acutely aware of the irreversible changes her choices had wrought. The man she had loved was gone, and her life would never be the same. She was left to grapple with the chilling reality of the situation, her heart heavy with grief and her mind a tumultuous sea of regret and despair. The days following the tragedy were a blur of confusion and heartbreak for Charlotte. The media frenzy that erupted in the wake of Derek's death was relentless. The story of the murder and the subsequent arrest of her husband, Francis, splashed across every newspaper and news broadcast. The sensational headlines painted a lurid picture of a sordid affair and a violent confrontation, turning their once quiet community into a spectacle for public consumption. Charlotte felt the weight of the world's judgment pressing down on her as she navigated this new, harsh reality. The phone calls and messages from friends and family were a constant barrage of shocked voices and disappointed tones. The betrayal that had been hidden in the shadows of her double life was now exposed for everyone to see, and the fallout was far beyond anything she could have anticipated. Her parents, once a source of support and understanding, struggled to reconcile their image of her with the reality that had come to light. They visited her home, their faces etched with a mix of concern and anger. "How could you let this happen, Charlotte?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "What were you thinking?" Charlotte had no answers. She sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap as she struggled to find the words to explain a situation that defied explanation. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, a gnawing presence that followed her every waking moment. The truth was, there was no easy way to justify her actions or the tragic consequences that had ensued. The legal battles began almost immediately. Francis was charged with murder, his once respected reputation shattered by the brutal crime. The courtroom became a stage for the drama of their lives, the prosecution presenting a damning case built on the evidence of the struggle and Derek's death. Charlotte found herself caught in the crossfire of a legal system that seemed determined to lay bare every detail of her personal failings. In the midst of these battles, Charlotte was forced to confront the full scope of her actions. She had always prided herself on being a good person, someone who valued honesty and integrity. Yet, she had allowed herself to become entangled in a web of deceit, betraying not only Francis but also the trust of those who cared about her. The realization of how far she had strayed from her own principles was a bitter pill to swallow. Her own reflection on the path that led her here was both painful and illuminating. She replayed the moments that had marked her descent into dishonesty, wondering where she had gone astray. The choice to engage in an affair, the decision to keep it secret, the failure to confront her feelings and address the issues in her marriage. Each choice seemed to lead inexorably to the tragic outcome. Charlotte remembered the early days of her marriage to Francis, the love and commitment that had once been the foundation of their life together. They had shared dreams and plans, built a life based on mutual respect and shared values. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. The comfort of routine had become a cage, and the excitement of the unknown had lured her into an affair with Derek. She thought about her own desires and the ways she had failed to communicate with Francis. She had hidden her dissatisfaction, allowed it to fester until it led to betrayal. The reflection was both a deep examination of her choices and a painful acknowledgement of her own shortcomings. The reflections were not just about the past, but also about the future. Charlotte wondered if there was any possibility of redemption, or if the damage was irreparable. The legal proceedings against Francis seemed to stretch endlessly, and each day brought new challenges and revelations. Charlotte's role in the affair was laid bare, and she found herself facing not just the legal consequences, but also the emotional wreckage of her life. Friends who had once been close distanced themselves, unable or unwilling to reconcile their image of Charlotte with the scandal that had engulfed her. Her social circle shrank, leaving her isolated and alone, struggling to make sense of the chaos she had unwittingly created. The community that had once been a source of comfort and support now viewed her through a lens of suspicion and disapproval. Charlotte's home, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, the echoes of past happiness now overshadowed by the grim reality of her choices. The walls seemed to close in on her, and every corner held a reminder of the life she had lost. As Charlotte faced the consequences of her actions, she was left with the difficult task of rebuilding her life from the ashes of her former existence. Months had passed since the night that shattered Charlotte's life, and the world outside felt as if it had been frozen in time while she wrestled with her own internal chaos. The media's frenzy had faded, leaving her to confront the quiet aftermath of her choices. Now, she found herself standing outside the cold, imposing walls of the prison, a place that had become the symbol of her fractured life. She was here to visit Francis, seeking some semblance of closure in the wreckage of their shared past. As she walked through the security check, the sterile, institutional environment seemed to close in around her. The metal detectors beeped, and the staff's curt efficiency reminded her of the gravity of the situation. Charlotte took a deep breath, her nerves a tangled mess of anxiety and anticipation. This visit was not just a confrontation with Francis, but a step toward understanding, healing, and ultimately moving forward. In the visitation room, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Francis sat on the other side of the glass partition, his face gaunt and worn from the harsh realities of prison life. The years of their marriage had left marks on him, visible in the lines etched deeply into his face. Despite the stark setting, there was an almost tender familiarity in the way he looked at her. Charlotte took her seat on the opposite side of the glass, her hands resting nervously on the table. "Charlotte," Francis said, his voice a mixture of weariness and regret. "It's been a long time." "Yeah," Charlotte replied, her voice wavering as she struggled to maintain composure. "It has." There was an awkward silence as they both grappled with the enormity of their shared past. Charlotte's heart ached as she saw the man she had once loved so deeply, now reduced to a figure in a prison jumpsuit. The emotional distance between them felt palpable, filled with the residue of pain and betrayal. Francis's eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, now held a deep, sorrowful clarity. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice breaking. "I knew. I had a feeling something was wrong. I suspected the affair for months, but I didn't want to believe it. When I found out the truth, it was like my whole world collapsed. I acted out of desperation and hurt." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Francis's confession. His words were like a bitter balm, offering a glimpse into his own anguish. The realization that Francis had been suffering, grappling with his suspicions and pain, added a new layer of complexity to the tragedy that had unfolded. "I'm so sorry, Francis," Charlotte said, her voice choked with emotion. "I never wanted it to end like this. I should have been honest with you from the beginning. I never imagined it would come to this." Francis looked down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "We both made mistakes," he said quietly. "I let my anger and pain control me, and I know I can't undo what's been done. But I want you to know that I'm sorry, too. I'm sorry for what I did, for what it cost us all." Their conversation continued, a delicate dance around their shared pain and regret. There were no easy answers, no way to fix what had been broken. But as they spoke, there was a sense of reluctant understanding between them, a shared recognition of their flaws and their part in the tragedy. As the visit drew to a close, Charlotte felt a bittersweet sense of finality. She had hoped for a resolution, a moment of clarity that would allow her to move forward. The conversation with Francis had offered a measure of closure, but the wounds remained. They were both left to confront their respective paths, shaped by the choices they had made and the consequences that followed. Leaving the prison, Charlotte felt a renewed resolve to rebuild her life. The journey ahead was daunting, filled with the remnants of her past and the uncertainty of the future. She decided to seek therapy, a necessary step toward understanding her motivations and learning from her mistakes. The therapy sessions were both challenging and illuminating, forcing Charlotte to confront the underlying issues that had led her down the path of deceit and betrayal. With each session, Charlotte began to unravel the complexities of her own emotions and actions. She explored her dissatisfaction with her marriage, the allure of the affair, and the deep-seated fears that had driven her choices. It was a painful but necessary process, one that gradually helped her to find peace within herself. The scars of that night remained, but she started to see them as part of her journey rather than defining her entire existence. Determined to forge a new path, Charlotte made the bold decision to move to a new city. The idea of starting fresh, away from the shadows of her past, offered a glimmer of hope. It was a chance to leave behind the remnants of the scandal and build a life grounded in honesty and integrity. The new city represented a blank slate, an opportunity to redefine herself and her values. As she settled into her new surroundings, Charlotte was acutely aware of the haunting echoes of her past. The memories of Derek, the agony of Francis's arrest, and the judgment of her community lingered, but they no longer held the same power over her. She was resolved to live a life of honesty, to confront her flaws openly and work toward becoming a better version of herself.